Good evening. On behalf of the Indiana University College of Arts and Sciences, I would like to thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Vanessa Clow, and I serve as the college's Director of Alumni Relations. Our Food for Thought live streaming series serves as an opportunity for our alumni and friends to hear from faculty experts, explore topics of interest, and stay connected with IU and the College of Arts and Sciences, regardless of your location. At this time, I'm delighted to introduce tonight's featured presenter, Dr. Lane Sorensen from the IU Department of Germanic Studies. Dr. Sorensen has served as a lecturer and outreach coordinator for Germanic Studies since the fall of 2020. His academic interests include language pedagogy and outreach, historical linguistics, Old Norse literature, and Middle Low German liver rhymes. He recently earned his PhD in Germanic Linguistics and Philology from IU in 2022. Following his talk, Dr. Sorensen will be joined by IU graduate student Kelsey Weiss for the audience Q&A session. You can submit your questions at any point during this evening's discussion. Simply click on the Q&A tab located in your webinar toolbar. Hover your mouse over your screen and your toolbar should appear. Now, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Sorensen for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Thank you so much, Kelsey, as well, for being here and helping moderate. So let's get into it. I also want to thank all of y'all for being here and letting me kind of nerd out on one of my passions, which has been teaching this course for about the past 3 years now, Vikings and Sagas. All right, so Vikings and Sagas, primary sources versus popular culture. I want to say I'm incredibly grateful to be able to teach this course. I took over teaching this course in spring 2021 after the late and great Professor Kari Ellen Gada passed away. Well, she retired and then passed away a year later. So much, well, I learned Old Norse with her in the Germanic Studies department, as well as the Vikings and Sagas course. So basically, so much of my knowledge comes from her, my learning and finding the resources that I found over time. So I thank her so much for that opportunity to take the course, and we in the Department of Germanic Studies greatly miss her. I also do want to reiterate that all mistakes in this presentation are entirely my own too. So I'd like to start with some popular misconceptions. So again, I started teaching this course in spring 2021. I also teach a very intensive version of it that lasts about 2.5 weeks for the intensive freshman seminar. And the first week of that course is taught over Zoom and has been the past few years. So one thing I like to ask from the get-go is I like to use the kind of Zoom whiteboard to ask students to basically draw or write their first and foremost conceptions of Vikings or Vikingness or Norse culture. And I really do tell them, please don't be afraid of offending. We need to see these stereotypes. We need to see these conceptions to address them in the first place. So we see some glorious artwork here. I have to say it's way better than anything I can draw, but we see that this slide is just replete with horned helmet figures. And so there is no evidence that the Vikings wore horned helmets, despite so much dissemination of that image and that material. That's something that really starts to spread during the late 19th century, especially with Wagnerian operas. But we also will look at that there maybe are some horned depictions from the Viking Age itself in a kind of artistic framework. So it's not exactly perfectly cut and dry, but so we see horned helmets, we see rage, exploration, long blonde hair, fighting was everything, fight to the death, fur coats, live in cold places, vicious robbers, building ships. We do have writing poems here, which was really fun to see, because we'll see in this presentation that poetry was so important in this culture at this time. The next year, around the same time, we see similar ideas when I ask students at the beginning of the course what the kind of first thoughts or images that come to mind. Strong, big beard. Career choice is interesting. That actually goes to that I'll touch upon one of the slides toward the end of the end of the presentation, mostly in Scandinavia. So when we're talking about Vikings and Viking Age, we're talking about people who lived basically between the 8th and 11th centuries in what is now modern day Iceland, uh, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, the Faroes and Orkneys as well to a degree, and also settlements in England and modern day Ireland. So that those are the peoples of the Viking Age. Weren't Christian, drank lots of alcohol. We see again raiding, pirates, but much stronger. Actually, that term pirates is very common really for centuries, especially like in the German language, let's say Seeräuber, which so sea robbers, so pirates, really before we have a modern usage of the word Viking. Although the word Viking we do find both as a noun, so someone is described as a Viking, and someone goes a Viking, so on Viking activity. We do find this in the saga material. We also have some things that are not so savory, not so fun about the Viking Age. For instance, someone wrote here, women had no rights. It is certainly correct that women at the time today, in a US American context, did not have nearly as many rights. However, women at the time did have more rights than their mainland European counterparts. Again, all they did was raid. They weren't traders. Biggest stereotype is that they were large brutes. So we kind of see this all over. So where does this stuff come from? It comes from not just decades, but well over a century of materials. I'd mentioned earlier the Wagnerian operas with like the horned helmets. Of course, we have Elmer Fudd with with the horned helmet, Kill the Wabbit, if anyone's seen this. The picture to the left is a meme. We see a Viking ship and a horned helmet here on the moon. And on the right-hand side, this is a T-shirt from the high school I went to in Waverly, Nebraska. Our mascot was the Waverly Vikings, and it really wasn't until a few years ago that I realized, like, okay, I remember seeing this image, this figure all over during school, but it really probably did unfortunately have an impact on some of my conceptions at the time, and it really stands out now, especially now that I know and that archaeology knows that there are no horned helmets, or at least we have not found archaeological evidence or literary evidence of horned helmets. We see this in comics too, right? So Hagar the Horrible. And if we do a Google search, I actually did this Google search today. What's interesting, the whole top line gives the Vikings TV series. We don't see horned helmets there, but we see people raiding and battles. So we see axes, we see swords. It turns out that swords were less common immediately during the time. Spears were probably the most common weapon of choice, as well as axes. This is what we have in the archaeological record. Swords, we do find them, but they're harder to come by. They're more expensive. And then the whole second line is the Minnesota Vikings. And that image too of the blonde dude with the horned helmet. I mean, it goes back to the shirt that I showed from Waverly High School, the high school where I went. And it's an image that many of us have probably seen time and time again. Now let's turn to the actual sources themselves. So I showed a bunch of examples of kind of some popular culture, and those are the things that might well have informed a lot of the students' conceptions or misconceptions of Vikings and what they looked like. Now, something like a horned helmet is not itself maybe a pernicious symbol, but the sense of like raiding and fighting, we do find a contemporary account, so an account at the time, at the beginning of the Viking Age, of the attack on Lindisfarne. Quote, "In this year, dire portents appeared over Northumbria and sorely frightened the people. They consisted of immense whirlwinds and flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. A great famine immediately followed those signs, and a little after that, in the same year, on 8 June, the ravages of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter." So we do get some real-time literary evidence of Viking raid, Viking attack. See here too that this is from a Christian perspective, what is being written here. So God's church, referring to the Vikings as heathen men. It's very common, especially in Old English at that time, to refer to the Viking raiders as, quote, Northmen. Another set of the primary sources, so the sources that were written at the time are certain laws and law codes. We have this in the form of certain books like Isländinga bók and Landnámabók, literally the land-taking book or the Book of Settlements. These things not only discuss laws and certain kind of maybe drier things like who had a farm where and this family and this genealogy, but it really provides an amazing amount of information here. And this is specifically in the Iceland context. So Iceland was settled around about 870, predominantly by Norwegians. And so we have evidence close to that time, so not right when Iceland was settled, but mention of these people settling it. So 3,500 people, 1,500 farms or so. And a lot of because of this, because of these sources, many Icelanders themselves can trace their genealogies back many centuries. I mean, what could you do with that information? Well, one company figured out, hey, why don't we use that information to create something that allows more medical information and medical access? So really keying into these genealogies. A side effect or happy accident of that, I guess, is a the Isländinga bók app, which basically allowed people also to avoid incest, because it turns out if you are on a more geographically isolated island over many centuries, you don't have as wide of a gene pool. And so the chances of hooking up with someone you're related to maybe in a second cousin sense, third cousin sense or so, is much higher in Iceland even today than in so many other places around the world. So that is a real-time use of the primary sources for a what I find to be a pretty funny but good thing, good development in terms of, hey, people looking for love, let's make sure they're not biologically related. The sagas themselves are described often like historical novels. One major problem, and the problem with even just the term primary sources is, okay, a primary source is something that's written at the time of action. That does not necessarily mean that it should be taken as the truth, as the factual truth. And one major problem with the sagas, with the Old Icelandic, Old Norse sagas, is they are composed centuries after the action or events that they describe. Rosedal, for instance, she writes, perhaps with the deliberate intention of glorifying a particular family in order to legitimize its rights to land or to a kingdom, or to endorse a certain policy. There are so many examples of sagas. One thing that I didn't know until learning about the material myself starting years ago was that the sagas are overwhelmingly anonymous. There's only really a couple that we can be fairly sure who the authors are. For instance, Egil Saga, Heimskringla, Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century is really Iceland's most famous author, and you could see him as kind of like the Shakespeare for the Old Icelandic or Old Norse language. Reading one of these sagas, Egil Saga, which is one of the longest sagas, I have students read this book. So it's a collection of sagas of the Icelanders, and Egil Saga is by far the longest one in there. I took this poll, and what do you know? I mean, some of the things, some of the stereotypical elements coming out: violence. We have some drunken scenes of Egil puking on someone. This bird here refers to a scene where we have a Queen Gunhild, who is in England. So Egil, the main character of the saga, is visiting England. He's not necessarily a nice dude by today's standards. He's killed a bunch of people, and also so many of his friends and family have killed a bunch of people too. A lot of that stuff is kind of it it just reads almost nonchalantly in the sagas. That's something that really surprises the students, is that you'll have multiple chapters that might be a page or two long each, and it'll often end with and then he died, or then she died, or then he was killed by this. And a lot of students were like, this feels like Game of Thrones. What's going on here? But this scene with the bird is when Egil is in Jorvik, so modern day York, and he basically has to compose a poem, a head ransom poem. And Queen Gudhild, what she does, which is, again, this, the way it's written, it's kind of like, well, you know, stuff like this happens. She turns herself into a bird because she is a shapeshifter, and she turns herself into a bird to basically tweet, to chirp at Egil all night so he doesn't compose the poem to basically save his head. And we'll get here to the importance of poetry. Why is he writing a poem in the first place? To another source, the rune stones. Now, there are some rune stones that are way older than the Viking Age, so including runic inscriptions that might even go back to BCE, so before current era, or BC, especially things like combs. There's a carving on part of a skull that's very old. So these things are around the time of the Roman Empire, and long before what we would call the Viking Age. There are more than 3,000 found in Scandinavia. The earliest tend to be in Denmark and Norway. And it's often inscriptions arranged in vertical rows that we see, but we see kind of more serpentine figures in the later runestone carvings. Here's a great example, the Rookstone, which is the longest discovered runic inscription, so early 9th century. It includes poetic meters, so again, the importance of poetry here, which is an alliterative poetry, and it contains lots of mythology and history, including there are scientists and linguists looking in the past few years at a mention of something called Fimbulvetter, or kind of like a apocalyptic winter, and pointing to an event centuries earlier that would have been like maybe a mini ice age, some kind of climate catastrophe. So this even includes something that alludes to climate change. I do want to point out that runes were basically a writing system before the advent of the Roman alphabet writing system that was used in Old English. In fact, that writing system really came to Old Norse through Old English. Old English itself had a runic system called Futhork. In Old Norse, it's called Futhark, so fa, u, tha, a, er, ka, those first 6 sounds or letters of the runic alphabet. Kind of like when we say alphabet, we're saying alpha, beta. We're listing those things in sequence. But it really is just writing for writing. There is mention, however, of maybe a divine origin of runes, and this mention goes back to some of the earliest written sources, written down manuscripts, like in the Poetic Edda, like in Sigrifumal and Havamal. So, quote, Odin, who is Odin, wrote runes on various holy things, shaved them off, and mixed them with mead, and, quote, sent them on wide ways. The gods got some, the elves and the Vanir got some, the Vanir being another class of gods like the Aesir, and some came to mortal men. This divine origin is the source of their magic. I will say that it is a very common misconception that runes are always magic. This is something that I see online all the time, and I get it. They're neat symbols, but all in all, it was primarily just a writing system. I do want to show real quick. I'm going to do stop share so that I can show another part of a recent runic find. And that is this. So this was back in 2021 in Denmark. Some guy went out with a metal detector, according to him, for the first time. Of course, that's the way it works. And he's around some farm in Denmark. Again, this is just 2 years ago, and stumbles upon basically the greatest, one of the greatest treasure hoard findings in Danish history. and it includes these bracteates. So basically, like these kind of medallions that were worn that have some runes, that have some mythological symbols as well, including maybe one of the earliest depictions of Odin. We also have Roman coins. So we are actually still finding runic material to this very day. It is that fresh, actually. And I read very recently that another runestone was found somewhere in Scandinavia that might be one of the oldest runic inscriptions found so far. So because these things have been covered in uh, plants in growth, or maybe sunk in rivers, we are bound to find them, and that is really exciting. There's also a tech brand whose logo is inspired by runes. Many of us use that brand today. I'm going to give you a second to kind of say it to yourself if you think you got the answer. And I'm just going to go ahead and assume you're correct. That is Bluetooth. So Bluetooth is a combination of the H and the B runes here, and that goes back to some of the history of Harold Bluetooth in terms of uniting, and so there was an idea of uniting devices, therefore Bluetooth. Unfortunately, there are also rune hoaxes. Many of you have probably heard of the Kensington runestone hoax. This is maybe one reason why we have the Minnesota Vikings. The lore of Vikings in Minnesota is because a runestone was found in the late 19th century. It was proved to be a hoax linguistically because it was essentially more modern Scandinavian words just written in runes, which does not make it old writing. I saw this. I took a picture of this here last year. This is on the side of a U-Haul, and I just love this. Like, Minnesota, mystery of the Kensington runestone. Do you know a stone tablet of North America exploration more than a century before believed? Did explorers leave clues that could rewrite history and etch proof in the stone? So at first I'm thinking, okay, maybe they're going to provide the information that it is a hoax. I went to this site at U-Haul, nothing, no more information. So maybe it's perpetuating the hoax. I will note, at least the Viking dude right here does not have a horned helmet. So that's something. And our very own late and great Professor Karigata was at the center of a runestone hoax. A runestone she carved, if I remember correctly, back in the 80s with some graduate students, and in Minnesota. It was found in the early 2000s, and she basically had to contact the people and say, "No, this is not real. We did this." So that's some fame from Germanic Studies right there from our department here at IU. Edda and Norse mythology. This one of the sources too that this goes back to the Codex Regius. So we're talking first half of the 13th century, this manuscript. It includes something like, if I remember correctly, about 28 poems, 28, 29 poems, a set of kind of more mythological and a set of heroic poems. We do find contradictions in the belief systems and or at least in the descriptions of who came from where. On the left-hand side here, you'll see this is nothing that goes back centuries, but this is an artistic depiction of kind of the Norse cosmology that includes Yggdrasil, which literally means Odin's horse. It is the world ash, or the world tree. It means Odin's horse because Odin sacrificed himself on it, and it's a gallows reference. We have Nidhogg, or hateful striker. We have Jormungandr, the world serpent, and the whole kind of realm or set of realms here at the top held within the skull of Ymir, the giant, the primordial giant at the beginning, who was formed in Ginnungagap, the yawning gap or the yawning void. We have the Bifrost, literally like the kind of bridge rest is what that is, or Alsabro, the bridge of the Aesir. We have three fates. So basically, fate, obligation, and becoming. That if that reminds you of Macbeth, If that reminds you of the fates in Greek mythology, you're not off. There seems to be a connection. And there might even very well be a connection of to the word sundogs, the thing where when you are in a cold atmosphere and enough ice crystals are in the atmosphere, and it creates this kind of diffraction where you see parts of the sun on either side. It is these wolves, these wolves that are chasing the sun and the moon. Maybe it is connected to that. And then right here in the middle, Midgard, so literally middle yard or middle realm, the realm of normal human beings. As I said, this was found in the Codex Regius. Sorry if I get the date right. Compiled in the 13th century. We do not know who compiled or who wrote this down, but we do know it is referenced by Snorri Sturluson in this next bit, the Prose Edda or the Younger Edda, or also called the Snorre Edda. This manuscript to the right here is kind of a great depiction of is a great depiction of some of the mythology, some of which you might not be familiar with. So here we have Odin, so the eye sacrificed at the well of Mimir. We have Hugin and Munnen, so thought in memory, his ravens. This is a form of runes, but it's a later medieval form of runes. It's not like the runes we would expect. We have Heimdall, who uses horn to call to action. And one of my favorite characters that I don't remember learning about when I was little was Althumla, the primordial cow who was there with Ymir, the primordial giant in the Yawning Void. She is the cow who licked the first beings into the first being into existence, and that being was if I remember correctly, the grandfather of Odin, and Odin was one of three brothers. So I'm going to skip across. I'm going to skip these just for the sake of time, and just go to some of the kind of prologue in the prose of this. So, in the beginning, Almighty God created heaven and earth. Snorri Sturluson writes this. This is now from a Christian perspective. We see we have mention of Noah's flood, no longer a desire for God, and then people basically anthropomorphizing or attributing ethereal mythological characteristics to various things in nature, like the teeth and bones of living creatures are the very rocks and stones that are around us all the time. And then people saw that in nature, in the heavens, seemed to be controlled. They gave names to these forces. And then Snorri writes that people from Asia arrived, and that these people were so beautiful and wise that they were basically venerated as gods and goddesses. Now, we're going to get into a less savory part of the Viking and Saga material, which is the now close to probably 2 centuries long misappropriation of the material by white supremacist or racialist movements or racialist thought. And what I'm seeing here is not hey, people from Asia are automatically worse, or this other group. It is a big deal. I take it to be a big deal, and I think a number of other scholars too, that basically the idea is this other group of people far away from where we are came, and they are so beautiful and wise that they were venerated as gods. So this is Snorri Sturluson trying to put in context that, like, this is why our people believed in the various gods like Odin and Thor and Frigg and Freya. Now, you could certainly call this exoticism, looking at the lens of today. It's of course hard not to be presentistic at times, and we have to, of course, be careful not to superimpose expectations of today onto that time. But what I'm not seeing is something that is a carry through in white supremacist and neo-Nazi lore, which is one of some kind of superior race. We do not find that in the primary material, and that is incredibly important. I'll get to that here soon. Further along in the prologue, Thor, so Chris Hemsworth here. And what's interesting is in the mythology, the Poetic Edda, there's actually a great kind of genealogical tree that I like to look at in Carolyn Larrington's wonderful translation of the poetic Edda, but Thor is a son of Odin. Here, no, it's actually Thor. After many generations, Odin, maybe a great grandson, great grandson, is born. So we actually have a contradiction already in the genealogy of gods that are as important in the lore as Thor and Odin. These words, by the way, Thor and Odin, we have in the English language, and they exist in many other Germanic languages. For instance, Tuesday for Tyr, the god of war. Wednesday here. So Mr. Wednesday, like in Neil Gaiman's depiction of Odin. Wednesday from Woden's Day, or Odin. Thursday for Thor. Friday for Frigg. Saturday and Sunday are different, of course, as well as Monday, but this mythology is also seated in the very language of the days of the week that we have. And so these ideas carry through. They're very long-lasting ideas. I want to get now to the importance of poetry, which is something that always seems to really surprise students, and that is that skalds, these kind of, you could think of them as bards in a way, not singing though, but reciting poetry, were essentially the rock stars of the time. We have a quote right here from Egil Saga chapter 8, quote, "Of all his followers, the king held his poets in highest regard and let them sit on the bench opposite his high seat." That is a big deal. And it is a carry through in the sagas and the fatr, which are kind of shorter form of sagas, that skalds are of such primary importance. And what's important about the poetry they transmit in oral transmission is oftentimes that poetry was used as a basis for a story. And then very likely a lot of the saga material was composed or fit around that poetry itself. Kennings are one of the students' favorite things to go over. So, for instance, swans of the gods of cargoes, or the dark falcons of the battle god. These are poetic circumlocutions to refer to something. So it's a way of saying something without using that word to say something. And it has poetic use where it'll use alliteration, that kind of meter of alliteration, to decide what word you're going to use. This refers to ravens. So the god of cargoes is Odin. So the swans of Odin are ravens, or the dark falcons of the battle god, because Odin has many names and he is a battle god. So the falcons of the battle god are also ravens. The oar of poetry, or sword of the gums. This is one of my favorites. This is the tongue, because it's the oar of poetry in terms of speaking. It's the sword that goes through between the gums. Very straight. I don't know. I find them to be strange and lovely interpretations of these things. We have longer ones, like the flame custodian of the sea of the point storm, where if you break it down, means warrior. And oh, they get so much longer than that. One of my favorites, though, is a mythological kenning that keys into what bad poetry is. So a kenning for bad poetry is the dung of the ancient eagle, or sometimes the ass mead of the ancient eagle. And that it it refers to a story where essentially Odin is able to drink from the mead of poetry, these vats of the mead of poetry. He takes the form of an eagle to escape out of a mountain, the laws of physics being broken here, and he craps out the bad stuff, and that bad stuff is what is bad poetry, whereas he brought the good poetry to the gods and to men. Now to the stuff that is not fun to talk about, but is greatly important to talk about, and that is the misappropriation and violence of this material. So I'm going to start with, also in the Nazi period, this really ramped up. But I do want to say that it goes back to the early 19th century already. For instance, in discussions about the Old English poem Beowulf, or in discussions about those things, we have scholars who are saying, no, this person or this figure has to belong to our people or our nation because our nation is superior in some way. So that already really seeds a lot of these ideas of superiority that turn into racist white supremacist notions that carry through that lead up to something like that help lead up to something like the Nazi period. For instance, the Nazis they did have a German science division that put money into finding some kind of pure notion of Germanic ideology. Um, an echo of this in popular culture in Captain America: The First Avenger is the character Red Skull. And if we look at Red Skull, we see this very Nazi looking character, maybe SS looking character, going after some kind of ancient Norse technology or technology of Asgard. And it was the case that Himmler, I mean, they spent money and time to find things like Thor's hammer. Of course, that never happened, and thankfully the Nazis were defeated. But that shows how powerful some of these sentiments were misappropriated, how much they were misappropriated and turned into nationalistic and racist fervor to the point of a kind of archaeological arms race. We also have that carry through well after the Nazis, unfortunately. So an Odinist fellowship that was established in 1969, Else Christensen, who joined the Nazi Party before that and really made connections to the white power scene. And it led to other groups, including down here we have the Wotansvolk, who condone the use, quote, of fire, bombs, guns, terror, disruption, and destruction to secure the existence of their people. Today, we would call that terrorism. We have to remember too that this stuff, it's not just decades old, it's very recent. So in 2017, 2 people were murdered after trying to defend someone from an attack in Portland, and the person, the suspect who committed the murder, yelled "Hail Vinland," which is a reference to Norsemen basically making it to North America. We do have evidence of that, but using this idea of like, okay, colonization and exploitation of Vinland, of North America, or that part of North America around, we're talking about like northeastern Canada here. But that is something that is not very old. This is something that happened in the last 5-6 years. And unfortunately, neo-Nazi and white supremacist gangs are present today and have been present for a long time. Maybe you've seen depictions of this guy. We see tattoo of Mjolnir, so Thor's hammer. We see the Valknot, and we see horns. Now, these images in themselves, these symbols in themselves, I do want to say, are not inherently white supremacist or neo-Nazi, but we unfortunately do see them used by a number of people who resort to extremist tactics like violence. So these, this does not come from nowhere. This does not come from a vacuum. There is a history of why this person is wearing and donning the kind of tattoos that he does. And what we're finding is that, okay, the Vikings, it wasn't something that was just, oh, you're a Viking because of this, because of your inheritance, or it's a matter of heredity. What we're finding is actually it's a job description in many ways. It's something where we see more people of greater genetic diversity, not only in Scandinavia but in other parts of Europe, Southeastern Europe, reaching toward like into modern day Russia, closer to the Middle East, Mesopotamia, that area, who are buried with the trappings of other Vikings throughout the Viking world. What has popular culture improved? Well, in many ways, students are saying the depiction of women. And that is something that is a good adaptation. Unfortunately, this is the case that even though women at the time did have more rights than their mainland European counterparts, they still did not have as many rights as in the US American context today. So students note Lagertha from Vikings or Valkyrie from the Marvel universe. We also have cases in the literature itself, in the primary literature. Thorgeir and Gunhild and Egil Saga, Alder and Unnen Laxdula Saga, and some of these other stories. We're looking at burials. So archaeologists are looking at burials where maybe it was just assumed this person was male. And we find 2017 DNA analysis shows this person was, quote, genetically female, this interpretation being someone with 2 X chromosomes. And we have the greatest ship burial ever with so many treasures that is basically dedicated to 2 women in the 9th century. I want to show real quick, about done with the presentation. In the top left, we don't have archaeological evidence of horn helmets, but this tapestry from the 9th century, we see a figure at the top left here with horn helmets, maybe some kind of ceremonial procession. And we see something here too that predates the Viking age, and the characters also have horns. So it is a complicated matter. And hey, we see it coming back to pop culture again. This is a very recent ad for Loki season 2 on Disney Plus. What I really have loved to see is just this past August, this was the poll for what are your first impressions or conceptions of Vikings and Vikingness? And we are seeing travel beards, raiders, scary war and combat, boats, ships, maniacs. What's very interesting to me is what has changed even in the 3 years. Just taking this poll, and granted, it's a smaller sample size. We're talking from this kind of class, maybe 60 students altogether in the IFS context. But in 3 years, this group, no one wrote or showed horned helmets. I find that fascinating and ask myself, what has changed? These are my sources. Thank you so much for your time, and we will go on to the Q&A.
So the first question from Jane comes from when you were showing the picture of the cosmology, the snake at the base of the tree, Malice, I forget what it is called. She wants to know, is the snake good or bad in the cosmology?
The great question. The snake is bad for the tree, at least. So the snake Nidhogg, or hateful striker, scornful striker, is described as gnawing at the roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree that is basically the kind of the carrier of the realms of the cosmology. And then there's a squirrel that runs from Nidhogg, hateful striker, to the top to a great eagle, and they basically kind of start crap with each other back and forth via this gossiping squirrel, and that doesn't help the tree either.
Okay, the second question comes from David. He said, could you please mention the sources of Icelandic legal structure as contained in Egil Saga and Snorri's prose and the Poetic Eddas, especially the actions of the yearly Thingvellir?
Oh, the thing. Yeah, so the general structure of that. Now, I'm going to say full disclosure, I'm no expert in that law system, but at least in these, so in the idea of the all thing, the big thing, which literally, so the Icelandic parliament to this day is called something like the all thing, which is the all gathering. So a thing in the sense is a gathering of people, and at that event, basically 1/3 of laws would be said by lagusögumaður, so people who are lagusögumenn, sorry, people who were the law speakers. Snorri Sturluson himself was a law speaker at this time. At the thing, this was where various matters would be deliberated and judged upon, including maybe things like, helping each other out, things like proper taxes. It could also be things like certain punishments or wergeld, so the price you would pay to a family member, a kinsperson of someone you hurt or you killed, and could even lead to something like ostracization. So someone being utlagen or outlawed. And if you were outlawed at the time, it meant you could be killed with impunity. Yeah, I hope that answers some of that, but I can certainly refer the person to more sources.
Jane had another question about Valhalla and the afterlife, just going in what all that is.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I have to say, I'm in love with learning about the mythology. It is also, there are times where I look at all the material and look at like the conflicting sources, and I feel like my nose is just gonna shoot blood out of it. There's just so much material to remember. Valhalla Valhalla is the afterlife where the Valkyrie, literally the corpse choosers, pick those in battle for Odin's afterlife, and in that afterlife, they are fighting the entire time and drinking and partying when they are not fighting. So the afterlife of a warrior who is worthy of Valhalla, who is chosen by Valkyrie, basically continues that afterlife. Now, Valhalla is not the only afterlife. There's also Folkvanger, which is Freya's afterlife. Freya being she's a twin sister of Freyr, and she specifically says in I forget if it's Lokasen, Loki's Quarrel, one of the other materials, where her hall has more seats. And when you say something like, hey, my hall, my afterlife can accompany more people, has more seats, it's basically one-upping the other person. And we have exchanges like that in terms of, oh, well, this is better than what you have in something like Loki's Quarrel, where gods and goddesses are fighting each other via poetry. They're having poetic battles or flightings at this time, trying to one up each other. So there's
Okay.
also Niflheim and Helheim, some of these other realms. So Valhalla is not the only realm, but Valhalla and Folkvanger are the nicer of the afterlife realms.
David wants to know what's the validity of hired mercenaries berserks?
The validity is I'd say it's there. So whether they were berserker necessarily, so the term berserker is described in the literature. We find it, for instance, in Egil Saga. Already in the first page, there's a line describing Kveldulfr or Night Wolf, and it says Han var berserker. He was a berserker, and as in someone who just goes into so much of a rage, a powerful rage that is very slaughterous to others, but then loses a lot of energy due to that rage. So these people certainly maybe could have been used as mercenaries. It is certainly the case that we have instances of Vikings being hired even to stave off or ward off other Vikings. This is one thing that is important to remember, especially in the face of things like misappropriation of the material by white supremacist movements, is that it is absolutely true, unfortunately, that there is a lot of violence that we're reading. And students have a lot of fun with it in many ways. And of course, it was a different time, but we're not really seeing any of that violence being framed away that says we're committing this violence because these people we're committing violence against look like this. And so Vikings in many ways were equal opportunity destroyers, equal opportunity raiders.
Andrew would like to know how accurate are shows like Last Kingdom and Vikings at depicting day-to-day life for Vikings? Do we have sources for everyday life?
These are awesome questions, by the way. I appreciate it. So I would say that from what I understand in terms of the scholars who know the material better than I do in terms of describing shows like Vikings, it is a better, more accurate depiction of day-to-day life than maybe something we would have seen 40, 50 years ago in some kind of fictionalized drama. Now, a show like the Vikings is based on saga material, so like Ragnar's saga, Lothbroki, and also Gesta Danorum and some of these other things where it's based a lot on the literature, on those primary sources, but because a lot of those primary sources are embellishments themselves, it's hard to say exactly how accurate they are. However, there are a lot of things. Now, I've only seen full disclosure, like the first 3 episodes of the show Vikings, so I don't know it very well. I do know that's a scene where they are speaking with Anglo-Saxon speakers at the beach scene. There's a bit of like mutual intelligibility between Old English and Old Norse. That certainly could have happened. For instance, Dr. Jackson Crawford and others have shown that this is possible. But the Old Norse that is used in the show is not, at least according, I remember Professor Karigata talking about this, quite frankly, that there was some certainly some problem points there. And unfortunately, I don't know the show Last Kingdom, though aspects of those shows taking slaves was absolutely a part of Viking life. So taking slaves who looked like them, taking people who looked like them or from these places they raided to sell off to bring other places and sell off to other places. So I think the depictions seem to be getting maybe more historically accurate is what the kind of general arc is.
Kathy had a follow-up question about that. She wanted to know, did the Vikings live side by side with Christian monks as depicted in the television show? And do you know if they left anyone alive in Lindisfarne?
Oh, in Lindisfarne. I have to admit, I don't have a definite answer for either of those questions. What I will say is living side by side with people of different belief systems, that happened for Viking Age peoples, not only whether they're Varangians in, the Varangians in Constantinople, but also in places like York, where Old Norse speakers were living next to Old English speakers who may have been very well been Christian, and Old Norse speakers who were practicing, well, paganism, but the old religion. And we see evidence of that like on coins. So for instance, a coin in York that has Thor's hammer on one side, but then like a sword like Christian cross on the other. To me, it seems very likely that they would have left some people alive, but probably taken them as slaves. But unfortunately, I don't know the definitive answer to that.
Alan had a question and he wanted to know, is there enough progression of written poems to see a change in the language and its use over time?
Yes, yes. For instance, we see things like in the poetry. That's why I mentioned earlier that the poetry is often a good tool to show this is an older stage of the language. One specific example of that is you have forms that are pre-rhoticized, meaning like the word var in Old Norse, which was var, which was vas in some poetry. And so that form where S hasn't been rhoticized, hasn't been turned into the R, we do find this in earlier poetry, and in later poetry, we don't find that as much. So that is one tool, kind of linguistic chronological metric we can use in dating poetry. Yeah, so there are certain ways of telling that. I apologize again, I'm not an expert in that, but that especially that pre-rhoticized form is one form I can remember.
Roberta wants to know if you have any comments on the claims of Viking rule in Kievan Rus. Kievan Rus?
Yeah. So what I'd say is I remember I took a course on it was called Russia and the Russians, and I know, of course, Ukraine, Russia are not the same, but in terms of Kievan Rus, we learned about the establishment of the Kievan Empire and the Rurik dynasty, and so there seems to be some kind of through line there. I don't know more about it really beyond that, especially if it's in reference to any like maybe modern day claims or modern day notions of actually this place belongs to this group of people or this other group of people. What we certainly know is that the Vikings made it. They made it north, they made it south, they made it west, they made it east, they made it many places, and very specifically along the rivers Dnieper and Volga as well.
Dave wants to know, within Viking population, were there separate clans and how were Vikings kings/leaders selected?
Very good. So, yes, is the short answer to that. in terms of like there could be warring factions based place to place. Once we get to a place like Iceland, there aren't kings really anymore. Iceland was founded, at least the Icelanders, the Iceland sagas themselves attribute the desire to go to a place like Iceland, to go west, was to get away from monarchies or get away at attempts of monarchy. And so in the Icelandic context, what we have are basically chieftains, the Goðar, people with the Goðord, or that token or authority of being a chieftain. That is the most kind of powerful figure there. And those would be those would be in smaller local contexts. Now that I don't know in terms of necessarily like square miles. We're talking, maybe beyond just a little town or region, but how those people are selected could be, sometimes it was just a matter of maybe dynasties. So someone's father was Gothi, and then it went to this person. But we're also talking about just showing up with wealth. So when we think of like a landed wealthy class, these farmers, especially in these farmers throughout Scandinavia who had the wealth and resources, were more likely to have those positions of authority. And I wonder exactly how consistently those authorities were chosen. I don't know, I have to admit.
Ron wants to know how self-contradictory is Norse mythology in terms of genealogy, specific functions of the gods, geographically and across time, and then how does it compare to other polytheistic European and world mythologies?
Yeah. So I would say that I'm not finding, so far what I've read in terms of the primary sources, I'm not finding it completely replete with contradictions. So for instance, that genealogy of who came first, Odin or Thor, between the poetic Edda and the prose Edda, that's certainly a contradiction. But in many ways, the deities are described very similarly in both Edda, and the prose Edda, the Snorre Edda, really does try to contextualize. In many ways, it'll take parts from the poetic Edda and to describe those specific stanzas, those specific parts of the poetry, try to add more context. And across the way to the some of how the cosmology fits, yeah, there's some contradiction going on. For instance, more information on that cosmology seems to be provided in the prose Edda, from what I found, especially regarding Aldumla, the cow, the primordial cow, who is not mentioned from what I remember in the poetic Edda. And how that compares to other polytheistic belief systems, I have to admit I don't know other polytheistic belief systems very well, but I mean we have three fates. It reminds me of the three fates in Greek mythology. One thing that a through line that shows up a lot is how petty the gods and goddesses are to each other. The way they act to each other is just so vile, so much so that one of my students recently compared it to the Kardashians, and I was like, that's pretty on point. That's really on point, actually.
Okay, one last question. Jim wants to know, what about agrarian versus raiding Vikings?
So in this case, going on a raid, going a Viking was maybe a job, especially during those times where the weather was most hospitable for doing it. So a lot of times these very Vikings themselves, when they're done raiding, when they're done plundering, if they have the means to return and don't stay longer at the place, especially stay over winter, they will then go back to a farming lifestyle and then switch it up, a lot of times based on weather and based on need and opportunity.
Do you have any recommendations for museums with collections of Viking Norse artifacts?
Yes, certainly the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo, Norway, the Viking Museum in Ribe, Denmark. A lot of these places. I don't know. There was a Viking exhibit in Denver a few years ago. I don't know if that's there anymore. In Newfoundland, so L'Anse aux Meadows. Sorry for butchering the French pronunciation there. There is a reconstructed kind of Viking settlement area. So there are some places in North America, but a lot in Scandinavia proper. Kelsey, if we have time, I want to ask you real quick, what was one of your favorite things about taking the course? Kelsey was a wonderful, stellar student in my course, and I'm so grateful that she's helped moderate questions. So I want to know from her, maybe what was one of your favorite takeaways from the course?
I mean, I just think the sagas themselves are very unknown to the public. I definitely didn't know about them going in. So I just personally I loved reading the poetic rhythm. I think it's just absolutely gorgeous, their kennings, and it's so important in showing like foundational aspects of humanity, of loss, of exile, of the body humor. And I just think it's absolutely beautiful to be able to read it and read the foundational aspects of human poetics and human creation altogether.
Thank you. No, that's lovely to hear. That's lovely to hear. And it helps me too. I love learning these things with my students and from my students. So it tells me what I should do in the future, what I should focus on in the future teaching this course.
Thank you again for joining us and participating in this evening's live stream. I would like to personally thank Dr. Sorensen and Ms. Weiss for their time and expertise. We are grateful to you all. Finally, I should acknowledge that events like this would not be possible without the support of donors who understand the value of a liberal arts education. If you would like to support programs like tonight's presentation or other opportunities that connect alumni and friends with the College of Arts and Sciences, please consider making a contribution to the Arts and Sciences Alumni Engagement Fund of the Indiana University Foundation. Until next time, please take care. Thank you.